Hello and welcome to My Book, a podcast about books and their authors, produced by Cine Ink based in London. I'm Loveleen Kacker. In this episode of My Book, I'm going to be in conversation with Adeel Hussain, author of the book Revenge, Politics and Blasphemy in Pakistan, published by Hurst Publishers, London.
For me, the interesting part is not that successive prime ministers are trying to sort of distract the public with the issue of blasphemy, if one wants to put it like this, but that they're able to do so, that issue is so powerful that you are able to to mobilize people to create a specific electoral force that you would otherwise not be able to do. And the TLP, which is the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, a new sort of political outlet, that at one point in 2018 was the party with the third highest vote count in Pakistan's elections, only has that as their agenda, as their political agenda. So they don't talk about any type of other progressive ideals or, redistribution of wealth, but their primary aim is to establish an even stricter legal blasphemy regime in Pakistan.
I am in London, while Adeel has joined us from Abu Dhabi. Thank you, Adeel, for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
So, Adeel, let me begin by setting the tone of this conversation. Though Pakistan has been plagued by incidents of blasphemy and religious extremism for many years, it is not the only country that is dealing with such issues. It's not even Islam alone that deals with blasphemy. Close to 70 countries criminalize blasphemy as well as apostasy. Many of these countries have imprisoned and executed blasphemers, vigilante groups have murdered them, and in some countries, medieval forms of punishment have also been meted out. In Pakistan, theological debates have explored the question of religious offense for a long time, and the checkered history of the Indian subcontinent, with its inseparable politico-religious debate, has again and again brought this question to the foreground. But however, today it would appear that Pakistan is leading the blasphemy debate, and almost 1/3 of the global arrests and convictions for religious insults were reported from Pakistan. I think it would be good, Adeel, if you began by defining what is blasphemy.
To find a broad sort of legal definition is a speech act. It's a speech act that seeks to defile something that is held sacred by a group of people. And that sacredness normally has a specific sort of religious foundation. And primarily it is against Abrahamic belief systems. So say Islam, Christianity, Judaism, the three big monotheistic religions that have very strong religious laws and codes.
But somewhere along the way, what you defined as offense has actually now become a crime.
True. So with the rise of the nation state and the administrative empires in the latter part of the 19th century, most things were codes in legal code. That's a development that happens globally, but it happens especially strongly in the British colonies. Partly that has to do with the group of British administrators responsible for India, who are very close to what is known as the utilitarian tradition and the prototypes of liberalism. And they seek to establish codes that they believe would be good in governing a large population. And governing India was never easy, so they began to incorporate specific laws, and part of the laws that they incorporated also addressed the issue of blasphemy. Now, why did they focus on blasphemy? Well, they had a very specific way of looking at Indian society in particular. And India is important here because it was the biggest and most precious colony that the British possessed. And they looked at the population and they very quickly came to the conclusion that here is a people where religion matters a great deal, and a great deal more than it does in Europe at the time.
In some ways, that seems to be a dichotomy, considering the Western way of thinking. It's the freedom of speech which seems to matter so much. What happened to that freedom of speech concept in the subcontinent?
It's something that the early liberals are struggling with when they lay down the law for the Indian subcontinent. There's those who are actually doing the administration, so who are in India and are reporting back as to which kind of laws are working and what kind of laws are not working. And there's the broad sort of ideological guardrails that are developed almost detached from any real life input. So if we take somebody like Jeremy Bentham, one of the great thinkers of the liberal tradition, then he was very reluctant to include any type of legislation that is outright directed against blasphemy, because he did not believe that sentiments should be protected in any kind of way. At the same time, liberalism was also a compromise, and was a compromise between different traditions that were trying to seek administrative supremacy on the Indian subcontinent.
Thank you, Adeel Hussain, for that. So I just want to go back now to India. So at the turn of the century, at the turn of the 20th century almost, what do we see? In Punjab, a minor skirmish between two people, Lekram on one side and a gentleman by the name of Mirza Ghulam Ahmad on the other side, get into this religious debate, which tends to escalate and get out of hand altogether, from writing pamphlets to verbally abusing each other. It just seems to escalate. How did the Ahmadiyyas come into this debate?
Ooh, that's a very big question. So let's take a step back and look at the kind of atmosphere or the kind of space that the British created for newish religious movements. So if we take the sort of watershed moment, as many historians do, to be 1857, 1858, it's the collapse of the old order. And the old order was upheld, as many believe, by traditional sort of value systems that were backed in some way by religion. So the moment when the British take over and the British crown becomes the new Raj on the Indian subcontinent, a lot of people have to reorient their worldviews. They have to reorient it because what they held to be of value is now being rapidly transforming before their eyes. And many people have labeled this as modernity, right? So this is like the big sort of transformation, and everybody has to sort of reorient themselves. The reorientation in India takes the form that many people try to seek refuge under the umbrella of religion again. And it happens in different pathways. There's new sort of strength that is developing in the sort of traditionalist circles. So sections of the Deoband are being strengthened in the long 19th century. But there's also people who try to think in more modern ways about religion. And they create reformist movements. So the 19th century is really the century of reformist movements. And we can pick out a number of Hindu reformist movements that are trying to seek to bring Hinduism in accordance with what they perceive to be modern values. And it also happens in Islam. The prominent sort of revivalist movements in North India are the Ahmadis, a small group that is founded by Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, who's part of the first debate that I sort of look at. And those revivalist movements are particularly prominent in North India. So part of the reason that much of my book is set in the North is because in the North we have these sort of urban centers where a new middle class is emerging. There's jobs, there's universities. So people go there and they start engaging with those religious revivalist movements because they have a foothold there.
Arya Samaj on one side and the sect that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad is going to set up.
Yes, and part of the reason that I focus on these two groups has to do with the fact that they speak to each other all of the time, more than they do with their religious compatriots. They're more interested in starting a sort of wider conversation, which is the Hindu-Muslim conversation, right, which by that time hasn't really happened in a systematic manner or in a mainstream manner. So these two groups are sort of at the fringes of their own traditions. At the fringes, I mean, in the sense that they are not representing the orthodoxy even at the time. So if you were to go to Benares and ask the traditional Hindu leaders, they would not accept that somebody like Dayanand Saraswati is a representative of Hinduism. And the same would be true if people were to go to Deoband at the time and ask them about what they thought, the Deobandis who represent this sort of orthodoxy, what they thought about Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, they would also not be in great favor of him being the representative of Islam. But these groups find each other precisely because they're at the fringes of their own communities and they need to justify their own existence within them. And one way of justifying it is by arguing with the other group and trying to convert people to their respective faith. So both groups have a very strong missionary wing where they try to bring people who are belonging to other faith into their own tradition. With the Ahmadis, it happens in the sort of Tabligh movement, with the Arya Samaj famously in the Shuddhi movement.
So this movement then just seems to get out of control altogether. It goes on to such an extent that it brings about the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1927.
Yeah, and I mean, it's normative to say that it goes out of hand. The thing is that the points that both of these movements are touching upon seem to strike a nerve. And they seem to strike a nerve in the sense that they're able to mobilize people to go to the streets. One of the big questions in politics is always, what is it that brings people to demonstrate and to stage strikes? What is the sort of ideological driving force that brings people to disrupt their daily lives in order to demand something or to ask something? Both of these groups are particularly good in mobilizing people. So they can bring hundreds of people to the roads and bring cities to a standstill. And the topics that they touch upon then later get absorbed and taken up by many of the nationalist leaders. So in the case of the Arya Samaj, there's a very straightforward direction into both the Congress Party, the right wing of the Congress Party, and later on, Hindu Mahasabha. Yeah.
I'm just asking you, is this thought very clearly established somewhere that the entire blasphemous movement began from the conflict between these two sects, or was there some other trigger to it?
I mean, the conventional way of explaining how blasphemy became important in India, there's really many sort of moments that people have picked. One of the moments is, say, the Islamization of Pakistan during Zia-ul Haq, who introduced a number of Shariatic laws and tried to Islamize the country or Sunniize the country. Another pathway of saying that when religion became really important in Pakistan would be the Muslim League. So the very drive towards having a separate nation states and the idea that Muslims and Hindus could not live together in a singular secular country of whatever sort, because the Hindu majority, numerical majority, would always outnumber the Muslims. So in a democratic system, Muslims would have it difficult to get their points across. So the basic structure of what is known as the two-nation theory. Other people believe that it was colonialism itself, so that colonialism undertook a specific misreading, an anthropological misreading, where they classified people into specific groups, one group being Hindu, the other group being Muslim. And then, because they had a specific power structure, were able to force these groups to perform in a certain way. Right? This is the very sort of Foucauldian based idea that power structures can actually create subjects rather than just be in the background and have subjects play out in the way in which they want to. So whichever one of these theory one follows, one could put the starting point somewhere else. The reason I've put it in that debate between the Arya Samaj and the Ahmadis is because I do believe that this was the first time that there was a popular mobilization around these themes, which hadn't really happened before in the same way. So even before people are talking about blasphemy, Muslims internally are talking about blasphemy, especially against the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But it doesn't really leave the sort of confines of the seminaries, right? So these are academic debates.
Academic
these are
debates.
not popular debates that people on the streets are taking up or that are discussed in newspapers. So that only happens towards the end of the 19th century. And here the two groups that are driving the debate are the Arya Samaj and the Ahmadis. So that's why I'm focusing on these two groups and that I believe that they have something to say. I'm also not discounting the other arguments. I do believe that all of them have their place. But I feel that this one has been particularly overlooked.
Other question that you made a slight reference to it, that there is a romantic vision, especially of a lot of people who have come from pre-partition. I mean, I see it in India for certain. People who have come from what is now the Punjab in Pakistan have this romantic vision of how Hindus and Muslims always lived very, closely together, that they ate in each other's homes, and they, short of marrying each other, they literally were very close together. And that if it had not happened, partition would not happen, Hindus and Muslims would have continued to live well. In fact, just to share a small incident, a few days back, we had as part of a function here, where a lot of the British Sikh community stood up and said that I think you should open up the borders, because we belong that side and our families and our ancestors are still there. So, is it a romantic way of saying it that Hindus and Muslims actually did live together, or was this inevitable, this divide?
These are big questions, so let me just break them down a little bit. So the thing is that the romantic notion of Hindus and Muslims living together also has some truth to it, particularly in the bigger sort of urban centers. There was also a great amount of commonality that people shared in terms of food, culture, clothes, that allowed them to communicate with each other just fine. But that intimacy also produced violence, right? So many of the sort of big incidents that take place in the run up to partition happen in the north, and they happen in places like Lahore, they happen in places like Sialkot, that are now seen as these sort of great centers where communalism was not able to hold any strong footing. At the same time, like from a Sikh position in particular, I can understand as to why they would ask for these borders to be opened, because Punjab was partitioned. If we think about the divide of these two countries, the border goes through a specific land that has never been divided before, and that, if we go back far enough, was also part of the Sikh empire. Many of their religious sites and
Are
shrines
still in Pakistan. Yeah,
in Pakistan. So I've
right.
just recently visited Kartarpur, which is Baba Nanak's place of burial. Nankana Sahib, his birthplace, is also on the Pakistani side of the border. So for them, it makes sense to be pushing for that demand. And there's a great amount of peaceful overlap that has existed over the centuries. Nonetheless, by the early 20th century, there was also a great amount of violence that we can't shy away from. So we can't just romanticize it away, because it took place and it did happen.
The other thing that seems to be a question that I want to raise, which is again from something that you have said, you mentioned the word Deobandi. I mean, not everybody understands what Deobandis and Barelvis are. Would you like to explain what these two thoughts are and what are the differences between them?
In very simple terms, I talk about both of these movements a great deal in my first chapter. But if we look at Pakistan today, the great majority of the Sunni Muslims would be Barelvis. And Barelvis is what is conventionally known as people who are sort of more Sufi inclined in the traditional outlook towards Islam. Now, Sufism has generally been equated with a sort of soft Islam, which is like more spiritual, and people may see like whirling dervishes in front of their imaginary eye. In Pakistan, it has never been this case, but it always had very strong orthodox elements in it. The Deobandis, on the other hand, are one of the earliest reform movements that come into the Indian subcontinent and seek to rationalize religion. Now, rationality has always been a force within religion, so it's not something new. But with modernity, rationality became like the touchstone in order to think about the world. And the Deobandis are introducing that in the Indian subcontinent. Part of the reason that the Deobandis are generally sort of clustered together with the Wahhabi movement that is springing up around the same time in the Middle East has to do with the fact that both of them are seeking to purify the religion and bring it back to its roots. And the Deobandis make up a smaller fraction of Sunni Muslims in Pakistan, which is overwhelmingly like a great majority of Sunni Muslims in Pakistan would belong to the Barelvi tradition, and a smaller fraction would be in the Deobandi fraction. Deoband itself as a town is also a seminary. That's why the movement is named after the city, and that city is in Uttar Pradesh in India.
No, that's very interesting to hear, because there is a school of thought which says that Islamic countries, the entire blasphemic issue is also being directed towards Muslims groups within yourself, not just the Ahmadiyyas, but even, for example, the Shias.
That is correct, and that has been the case right from the beginning. Part of the sort of big academic divide that happened between the Barelvis and the Deobandis happened around the question of the status of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So, for the Barelvis, the Prophet Muhammad is like the guiding light that is furnishing the inner spirituality of Islam. For the Deobandis, who approach Islam with a dash of modernist rationality, they would say that the Prophet, peace be upon him, is a mortal like all other mortal human beings. So therefore, he should not be venerated in any heightened form. For the Barelvis, that itself is an attack on on multiple doctrines, but on one of the doctrines, which is to say that the Prophet had a very special place and deserves a very special veneration. So when we see the veneration of the Prophet, peace be upon him, then of course both of the traditions do so with great zeal. So it's not exclusive to the Barelvis, but the Barelvis tend to do it more than the Deobandis, so much so that the Deobandis would say that some of the Barelvis are already committing blasphemy because they're going too far in the veneration of the Prophet. And the Barelvis, on the other hand, saying to the Deobandis that they don't go far enough and therefore they're committing blasphemy. Initially tended to be very hypothetical academic debates that are happening between different clergymen, and I draw on them in my first chapter. But they also had profound impact on the ways in which both of these movements reacted to each other in the latter part of the 20th century.
Welcome back. I am in conversation with Adeel Hussain, author of Revenge, Politics and Blasphemy in Pakistan, published by Hurst Publishers UK. This book is available on Amazon and other outlets. Adeel Hussain is an associate professor of legal studies in New York University, Abu Dhabi. He has a PhD in the history of political thought from the University of Cambridge. He has also written Law and Muslim Political Thought in Late Colonial North India and co-authored the book Nehru, The Debates That Define India, along with Tripurdaman Singh. So, Adeel, now let's come to independent Pakistan, let's say that. And then we find the entry of the Majlis, which is one very big conflict again. Tell us, how did this happen? How did the Ahmadiyyas, who were leading the blasphemy debate against the Hindus, have now become the targets of blasphemy itself?
When Pakistan comes into being, there's a bit of an identity crisis that takes place because it's one of the few countries that is solidly created based on a sort of metaphysical connection that citizens have with each other, the metaphysical connection being Islam. There's nothing else very much that unites them. I mean, they're divided in terms of religion, language, ethnicities. You can bring any other markers up.
Language.
You will find them. Yes, you will find them in Pakistan. And the idea is that, well, but what we have in common is Islam. And one of the ways in which that sort of early crisis materializes itself is in the Constituent Assembly debates. So the Constituent Assembly debates are debates where many of the political leaders come together and they meet in Karachi and Dhaka and they discuss about which sections or what words should eventually make up the Constitution of Pakistan. And it's a great deal of divergence of opinion that sort of goes in there. And it begins at its earliest with the very way in which, of what kind of country Pakistan should be. India, on the other hand, has declared itself secular. And Pakistan sees itself as primarily a Muslim nation, but doesn't really know how to incorporate that Muslimness into a constitutional text. The first Constitutional Assembly doesn't really come up with any type of cohesive answer and is later on dissolved by a governing general at the time. So by the time Pakistan is created, the debate around blasphemy is no longer an Arya Samaj Ahmadi debate.
Right.
It has shapeshifted and has taken very different forms. It has been, at least for 20 years, used by the Muslim League leadership in order to whip up support for the separatist movement. So by saying that because the Prophet, peace be upon him, is defiled in India, part of the ways in which we can rectify that kind of blasphemy is by creating our own nation states where we can protect the Prophet. Ahmadis become an early target because they themselves are espousing of a view that is held by many other Muslims to be blasphemous. So they believe that a prophet has appeared after the Prophet Muhammad. And because the doctrine, the Islamic doctrine known as Khatmi Nabuwat, so the finality of prophethood, dictates that no other prophet can appear after the Prophet Muhammad. So he is kind of the seal of prophetdom. They believe that that's like one of the biggest blasphemous acts that a human being can make. And their prosecution is also not something that begins immediately after Pakistan's creation, even though the Majlis-e-Ahrar is outraged about the fact that a number of political leaders in the early years of Pakistan's creation still belong to the Ahmadi faith. Most famously, it's Zafrullah Khan, who is Pakistan's first foreign secretary, but who even before he became Pakistan's first foreign secretary has rendered a great amount of services to the Muslim nationalist cause by being the president of the Muslim League in the early 1930s. He was also on the Viceroy's Executive Council, which was the highest decision-making chamber during the latter part of colonial rule, where he had a number of very influential portfolios. He was one of the 3 judges at the Federal Court, which is the precursor to the Supreme Court of India. So in the 1940s, he was really at the helm of checking the transgression of the colonial state when it came to its war powers during the Second World War.
Adeel Hussain, what is the role of Allama Muhammad Iqbal in this whole blasphemy history as we see it?
So Allama Iqbal plays a very central role in the development of blasphemy in the Indian subcontinent. And partly it has to do with the fact that he takes up that debate and nationalizes it. So he makes it a national talking point. And the reason as to why he's able to do that is because of his great prominence. So in the 1930s, he's considered widely to be like one of the premier Muslim spokespeople who can sort of captivate the minds of millions of Muslims. And he's proven to do that through his poetry primarily. So when Iqbal in the 1930s sort of picks up the issue of blasphemy, partly he does so because that's what's happening around him. He lives in Lahore, and Lahore is really ground zero for most issues that are related to blasphemy. And Iqbal takes up a very specific cause, and the cause that he takes up is of a vigilante killer who's avenged a blasphemous act against the Prophet, peace be upon him, which was a publication of a book by an Arya Samaj printer. And Iqbal feels that this young man should not be hanged. And he believes he should not be hanged because he has merely protected his religion. And suddenly the blasphemy debate, which up until this point has merely been has been more at the fringes, becomes the primary talking point. The second thing that Iqbal does, of course, as a lawyer, is that he demands stricter legislation. So he pushes the colonial state to sort of react to these pamphlets that are being distributed with foul language against the Prophet, peace be upon him. And he says that, well, that needs to stop. And because he takes this sort of dual approach where he brings religious/theological debate into the legal arena, Iqbal's role cannot be overstated when it comes to the blasphemy issue in the subcontinent.
Now, what I see is that successive prime ministers in Pakistan have used the blasphemy issue to divert attention from what could be regarded as more fundamental issues like poverty or women's issues or anything, jobs. Is my reading of the situation correct? What opinion do you have on this?
Yes, so one can approach this from multiple sort of ideological lenses. So if we take a social progressive lens and we sort of look at it, and then we can say that, well, the political development of Pakistan has been blind to specific causes, say the women's rights cause or for holding up the rights of minorities, etc. If we look at it from the Marxian ideological lens, then we can say that, well, the real problem is that workers' rights are not upheld in the same way as they should. And there's a weird feudalism that has sort of crept into Pakistan successively. So none of these are really the primary concern that I have when I sort of bring up the issue of blasphemy. When I bring up the issue of blasphemy, I'm primarily pointing towards the specific salience that this issue still has with the wider population. So for me, the interesting part is not that successive prime minister are trying to sort of distract the public with the issue of blasphemy, if one wants to put it like this, but that they're able to do so with that issue, that issue is so powerful that you are able to to mobilize people to create a specific electoral force that you would otherwise not be able to do. And the TLP, which is the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, a new sort of political outlet, that at one point in 2018 was the party with the third highest vote count in Pakistan's elections, only has that as their agenda, as their political agenda. So they don't talk about any type of other progressive ideals or, redistribution of wealth, but their primary aim is to establish an even stricter legal blasphemy regime in Pakistan.
And so we see how step by step you sort of chip away at the freedom of and so first you have the Ahmadiyyas being declared as not being Muslim and not having some kind of rights for.
So they're declared constitutionally to be outside of the fold of Islam and non-Muslims. And there's a specific punishments if they either act as Muslims, perform as Muslims, or call themselves that.
And then it goes on to criminalize it further, to bring in life imprisonments and then death. And, it sort of just seems to go on that track. Now, and you also used a very interesting word, is the creation of the shaheed, quote unquote. So the immense emotional power that religion seems to have to evoke the masses and to get them all together against a person. Like, I was very interested in the Chima case that you have written in the book, and how from a young student who was maybe mobilized by a particular thought process, which many young people are idealistic and they do want to follow their own thoughts, and suddenly he's become this hero in spite of the fact that he actually committed suicide, which would go against the Islamic way of thinking. And that's where I think you use the word shaheed, and that I found very interesting, because it's interesting in the entire subcontinent way of thinking, that you create an issue which is so powerful emotionally that you're able to gather the entire population around an idea.
That is true. I do believe that the issue of the specific image of the martyr is important everywhere around the world, right? So whenever you have a sort of broader ideological cause, anybody who's given their life is, of course, celebrated in the highest forms for, standing up to that ideal. In the Indian subcontinent, as you also know, the position of the martyr is a very, very powerful one. Yeah, so the Jima case arose in Germany, where a young Pakistani student who was studying at a technical college in Mönchengladbach went with a knife to the Axel Springer house. Axel Springer is like one of the big German publishers that had vowed to free speech principles and reprinted the famous Danish cartoons against the prophet. Because they reprinted them, there was a backlash around the world. So many people stood up and said that this is not really what freedom of speech means. The moment you move into an arena that hurts other people, you may have to rethink where your freedom of speech stops. Jima did not take the sort of discursive approach of participating in the sort of wider public sphere. He took a knife. He was visiting his sister in Berlin at the time. He took a knife and went into the Axel Springer house. He's immediately caught by security and brought to a German police station. And the German public prosecutor, is thinking about what to do with him. Now, in Germany, for attempted murder, as in many other jurisdictions, there actually has to be an attempted murder. And Jima hadn't really gotten to that stage, right? So he was just in the lobby with a knife. And so they didn't really know what to do with him. So they did like a lot of background checks in order to see if there was any sort of link with a terrorist organization. They couldn't find anything. And by the time that they were still looking as to how they would want to charge him, he had committed suicide in his jail cell in Moabit, which is one of the prisons in Berlin. Now, the Jima case is interesting because the reception was very different in Pakistan, where it became a big political issue, where all political parties were saying that this young man had given his life for upholding the honor of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and therefore Pakistan should take some strong action against Germany, some strong diplomatic action against Germany, in order to show that they're serious with their mission, that as a nation state, Pakistan stands primarily for the fruition of Islam.
I found the Chima case very interesting because it is the first case where you actually see how somebody who's not necessarily a hero has overnight turned into this hero, where his body is received in state and the entire public is mobilized, and overnight a hero is created.
Absolutely, and that all the political leaders make it to his funeral. Imran Khan from the PTI is there, and so are the leaders of all the other political parties, because they want to associate themselves with that cause. And it's secondary, so they may also be believing that there was some genuine good in his action. I'm not denying that it's not what they believe, but at the end of the day, it's important for any political leader in Pakistan to also associate themselves with this agenda.
Another case, which is somewhat similar, though I don't think it's fair to say that, is the Asia Bibi case, for example. It also got even bigger international headlines than did the Chima case. So here we have this young woman who gets into a local quarrel. What exactly happened with Asia Bibi, and how did it culminate in a murder?
So the Asia Bibi case is really the case that got me interested in the entire blasphemy issue in Pakistan. So I'm a constitutional lawyer, so primarily what I like to look at is constitutions, and this case was pending at the Supreme Court in 2018 when I first started engaging with this issue. So the Asia Bibi case goes back to a quarrel, as you rightly mentioned, between women who are field workers and plucking berries in close to Nankana Sahib, which is in Punjab. And one of them accuses the Christian lady Asia Bibi of having blasphemed the Prophet Muhammad. And that is taken up by the local clerics, who bring her to court, where she is sentenced to death almost immediately. She appeals that decision, and then in each decision that it goes up to the higher courts, that death verdict is kind of affirmed.
Can we understand what Salman Taseer's role in this was, and who was Salman Taseer?
So Salman Taseer is a very prominent Pakistani politician. He was very close to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Actually, he wrote one of the first biographies. It's a very fine biography of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, a lot more critical than I had assumed before I read it, given that he was a member of the PPP, the party that Zulfikar Ali Bhutto sort of founded. Salman Taseer is in many ways what one could call a classic liberal, in the sense that he sees the great injustice that is sort of meted out against Asia Bibi in various court cases. And because he's the governor of the Punjab at the time, and Pakistan is under a PPP government, so Asif Ali Zardari is the president of Pakistan, he feels that this is the right time to take a stance against the issue of blasphemy in Pakistan. He also has a personal interest because in his biography of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, he's very critical of the ways in which Zulfikar in 1974 supported the religious groups in banning the Ahmadis from calling themselves Muslims, right? So he's coming from that sort of
That
tradition, and he
position.
feels that, well, now is the time to sort of rectify that ill that has found its way into Pakistan. He goes to jail where Asia Bibi is kept in the Punjab, and he asks her to file a petition, a pardoning petition. In Pakistan, the president has the power to pardon prisoners. And during that speech, he says that he considers the blasphemy law a black law. So he doesn't think that it's something that should still be on the statute books, and Pakistanis should sort of reconsider its role in its legal and political system. And that creates a huge sort of backlash that eventually leads to his killing by his own security guard. So his own security guard sort of shoots him down. And then there's a very strange dynamic that is playing out in Pakistan, because even though one of the highest constitutional, like the person who's occupying one of the highest constitutional offices is murdered, at the same time, very few people are willing to even attend his funeral because they're afraid of the backlash that will happen in the country, and where they will stand, or where people will perceive them to stand on the blasphemy issue. The funeral of Samant Tasir is held with very high security. And on the other hand, his killer, for the longest part, is celebrated publicly. There's hundreds of thousands of people who are marching the roads of Lahore and other cities, who are celebrating that the honor of the Prophet has been protected, because the person who wanted to bring a change in the blasphemy law has been stopped from doing that. The second person, relatedly, who's often forgotten in that debate, is Shahbaz Bhatti, who was also a minister in the Pakistan's cabinet, the Minister for Minorities, who also speaks out against the blasphemy laws and is also shot dead in his car while driving to a political function. So the Asia Bibi case really showcases how, in the highest echelons of Pakistani politics, not able to sort of stand up and speak about transforming or changing the blasphemy laws that are now in place.
I wonder, where will this end? Is there any hope that the blasphemy laws will ever be toned down? I won't say that they'll go away, but where do you think all this is going?
There's always hope, in the sense that Islam has always had an internal mechanism to bring about reform and change in the outlook of Muslims. Like, if we look at Islam as a religion over the past 1500 years, then that's always been the case. So I do feel that as these debates were sort of constructed in the 19th century, there's also other pathways that Pakistani Muslims can take. And for that, we can look to other Muslim countries that that may have blasphemy laws, but that at the same time do not mandate the same type of sentences that Pakistan does. Like, one of the flashpoints in Pakistan really is that the mandatory death sentence has been imposed by the sort of Sharia courts. Like, that's the thing that in Pakistan is really qualitatively different from other Muslim countries. But Pakistani Muslims can look across the border and see how the issue of blasphemy is dealt with in other Muslim countries, and also orient themselves there. And blasphemy has also become like kind of a global debate. Like, it's no longer a debate that is merely centered within the Indian subcontinent. But if we look at, for instance, the Danish cartoons, then that was very much a global event. If we look at the recent issues that have sort of sprung up in the Nordic countries with acts of Quran burnings, then that's also something that is happening on a global stage. And I do feel that change in that direction is in a more sort of discursive direction is always possible.
And I think change will best be served if it comes from within the community.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Only if it comes from within the community. And there's a number of religious leaders, both within Pakistan and outside, who have taken different positions regarding the severity of the punishments that are normally meted out in blasphemy cases. So it's not something that is sort of going completely unchallenged, even within Pakistan itself and within the sort of Muslim Ummah at large.
Adeel Hussain, I'm actually amazed at how frankly and how well you've spoken, and I do like the tone that you have taken, very balanced. We in India are also beginning to face a somewhat similar kind of a situation. One worries which path we will go down. I mean, so far we have very proudly, as you had mentioned somewhere earlier, rode on the back of a very strong and good constitution. We have had free and fair elections. Secularism has largely been there. And I, for example, belong to the Sikh community. So whether you're a Sikh or a Hindu or a Muslim or a Christian, by and large, people have been allowed to follow their faith. But nothing remains the same, does it? And as we have seen, that religion seems to exert an enormous power and influence on the minds of the people of the subcontinent. And we are seeing a similar kind of a debate emerging in India, for example. Any thoughts on that?
That's correct. And there's multiple ways of looking at it, but I always thought, or what I was always astounded by when it came to India, is not so much that it's falling back into the sort of communalist trap, if you want to call it that, but that they managed to establish for a number of decades a tradition of secularism that in a way was entirely alien to the Indian subcontinent. And I do feel that part of the reason had to do with Nehru. So you mentioned one of the other books that I've written with Tripurdaman Singh, which is on Nehru, but really having a political leader who was pushing a specific vision for almost 2 decades onto the entirety of the country allowed India to sort of take a different pathway, sort of deviate from the pathway that Pakistan has taken. And now I'm feeling that India is sort of reliving the 1950s in Pakistan all over again, only with a 70-year delay. And if one looks at the rhetoric of the BJP, and that's not the rhetoric that is sort of coming from the top with Narendra Modi, who's been very restrained in his recent commentary. But if one looks at the assertions that are coming from the RSS, the sort of ideological backbone of the BJP, then they give one a great amount to worry about of what the secular future of India is going to hold. And the worst fears that the Muslims had when it came to a secular India are now in a way actualizing. So India is looking more and more like the caricature that Jinnah saw in the 1940s and that he wanted no part of.
I'm going to end on this note that there will be better hope and future for both Pakistan and India. And considering that we have such a long and shared history, that we will see better relations, and both the countries will treat their minorities well, as they should. And we learn from other countries that also have diversity and have done a better job than maybe people in the subcontinent have. So I will thank you, Adeel Hussain, for a very frank discourse on a troublesome question. Sometimes you need to be away from an explosive situation to probably get a perspective on it.
Thank you very much, Loveleen, for having me.
You have been listening to a conversation with Adeel Hussain, author of the book on revenge, politics, and blasphemy in Pakistan. This book is available on Amazon and all other outlets. I hope you enjoyed listening to this broadcast. We would love to hear from you, and if you have any feedback or any questions, please do write to us at post@Cineink.com. In our next episode of my book, we will be back with another author and another book, because this show is about authors and their books. This podcast has been produced by Achla Sharma and Parvez Alam for Cine Ink. To listen to other episodes of my book, you can visit the Cine Ink website, www.cineink.com. Cineink podcasts are available on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, and YouTube. Thank you for listening to this podcast by Cine Ink. Until we meet again, this is Loveleen Kacker. Goodbye.